Greetings, Mr. Miniatis and my fellow members of the History 102 course. I hope all is well. Hope the day is going well for you. And today I'm going to present to you the Battle of Okinawa. Now, the world is at war, okay? We're in the midst of World War II, which is particularly the period between 1939 and 1945. Now, the Battle of Okinawa fits into a series of battles between the Americans and the Japanese that we refer to as the Pacific, the War on the Pacific, or the Pacific Theater. And these battles are primarily naval battles as they occur over the Pacific Ocean. Now we see boots on the ground appear on various island expeditions and conquests. Now, where we're at, the Battle of Okinawa is on the rear of World War II. It's at the ending of World War II, just to give you guys a scope, just to paint the picture for you guys. Okay. But before we move on to the real nitty gritty, so to say, of this battle, I see it's necessary to address what sparked conflict between the Japanese and the Americans prior to World War II. Events like the Great White Fleet, that was one event in particular which occurred on December of 1907. This event, President Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States at the time, ordered the Great White Fleet, which consisted of 4 squadrons of warships. The picture on the right is the Great White Fleet. But these 4 squadrons of warships are manned by about 14,000 sailors and marines. He ordered this fleet to essentially sail around the world because um um excuse me because at this time the Japanese Navy dominated the Pacific. Okay, and now Theodore Roosevelt wanted to prove his power. He wanted to, make a statement. So the dispatch of this fleet acted as a way to impress Japan in some sorts, in a way to awe them. And this also acted as a way to show that the U.S. Navy could ship from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So at the time, it was the U.S. Navy was stationed in the Atlantic. So this is going to build tension between the Japanese and the Americans. Because Japanese, I mean, if you're a neighboring country and you see an entire fleet being commanded to go around the world, you're not gonna take this lightly. You're not gonna brush this off the shoulder. Okay. So the Japanese take this as almost an insult because they're trying to be a great military force, a great military power. And so this is just going to build tension between the Americans and the Japanese. So now, when the American fleet is stationed at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese are going to feel threatened by their presence in the Pacific. So the American fleet is stationed in Hawaii, well, the island of Oahu to be exact. So the Japanese feared that in the future the U.S. might interfere maliciously in perhaps a danger Japanese goals on the mainland of Asia, because the Japanese were fighting the Axis powers. And so this initiates the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, they attack Pearl Harbor, the Japanese forces, and they destroy about 20 American battleships, 300 airplanes, and killing about 2,500 American men. So this event basically almost cripples the American fleet. Okay. And about shortly after this event, the occurrence of Pearl Harbor, the Americans declare war on the Japanese because they're not going to get away with that, right? So they declare war, and thus begins the battle in the Pacific. Now, in current time, not in current time, I should say, the year is 1944. Okay, let's step in the shoes of the Americans for a moment, if we will. It's been 4 years since the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor. 3 years since the Japanese raid on Pearl Harbor, and we're about 3 years into the war. And in this point in time, the U.S. has been victorious in both the battles of Midway, and they are approaching the Ryukyu Islands. Now because of this, the U.S. has gained momentum in the Pacific region, and it now looks like the Americans have the upper hand in the war overall in the Pacific theater. Now, on October of 1944, the American forces directed a siege of the Ryukyu Islands. And now, Okinawa, being part of the Ryukyu Island chain or system, is seen as the most important and most valuable in order to take control, in order to essentially win the war in the American eyes. Okay, so Okinawa basically serves as a threshold to the 4 main islands of Japan's homeland. And for the U.S. taking control of Okinawa was a necessary step in order to penetrate and invade the Japanese homeland. Now, this is because Okinawa is about 300 miles from Japan, okay, which would put the U.S. in range of Japan's major cities for the Boeing B-29 bombers. So, Boeing B-29 bomber, as seen on your screen right now, as you're seeing on your screen right now, it is often referred to as the B-29 Super Fortress. Now, this thing is about 99 feet in length and has a wingspan of about 141 feet. Okay, Super Fortress is kind of an understatement. Also, I forgot to mention that the battles in the Pacific were primarily naval battles, you see, that consisted of battleships and aircraft carriers. Now, aircraft carriers could only hold a certain amount of aircrafts at a time, and securing an island meant that the island's resources and terrain can be utilized for the construction of air bases, thus leading to more effective aerial combat. Now, securing an air base meant you can use the B-29 Super Fortresses. Now, I would not want to be greeted by one of these suckers in combat. I don't know about you. It was armed with about 10 50 caliber machine guns and one 20 millimeter cannon. Okay, they can do some serious damage. And it had a bomb capacity of 10 tons. Okay, so these aircrafts are going to play a crucial role in the Pacific theater, and is ultimately going to be one of these things that dropped the first atomic bombs on Japan, or on Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Now I'd like to introduce you to these two gentlemen. The one on your left is Simon B. Buckner Jr. Okay, he's a Kentucky boy, born and raised. Born in the year 1886. He's a lieutenant general of the United States Army, in which he commands the 10th Army in the Battle of Okinawa. And it's going to be his strategies and military planning that are going to play a big role in the invasion of Okinawa. He was known for his constructive planning, I should say. In other words, his methods were very thought out. His methods were very, very down to the T. Partially, this is because of his 17 years spent in the service military schools. In hindsight, this creates a strong background that can be utilized in the invasion of Okinawa, in which he utilizes. Now, the man you're seeing on your right is General Mitsuru Ushijima. He was born in 1887. He is a Japanese army commander during the Battle of Okinawa. And initially, Ushijima actually disagreed with the bombings of Pearl Harbor as stated it was foolish to get the U.S. involved with the war. As he stated, it was foolish. However, it was Ushijima's skillful defensive tactics that led to the outnumbered Japanese to put up a fight to even have them a chance, because during this time, the Japanese are being pushed back. The Japanese, on paper, are the ones that should lose, the ones that are outnumbered, and the ones that are kind of on this constant loss sort of thing. Ushijima was known to be a man of his word, and when they heard about him trying to spread his ideologies about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, about getting America involved in the war, he was actually removed from his position from the Officers Academy in 1942, from the fear that he might influence others about his views on the war, make others discouraged, or, not agreeing with the Japanese, what they have done. And he was known for leading from the front lines regardless of the risk. So, now, the U.S. strategy. Okay, during the war in the Pacific, the American advance consisted of two main points, okay? So, they put their focus on the islands of the Central Pacific, which included the Ryukyu Islands, and on the areas of the South and Southwest Pacific, where we would see naval battles. So they kind of split their advances into two parts, essentially, to split the enemy in two parts, because they didn't want the enemy going head on with what they had head on, with all they had head on. Now, what they wanted to do was to have a constant pressure on the Japanese military naval powers. So they were persistent, and by forcing the Japanese to fight in the two fronts, this didn't allow the Japanese to um, prioritize where they needed to prioritize the most. But although the U.S. seemed to have the upper hand in the war, in the battles, the American knowledge of the enemy and the island of Okinawa was quite limited, actually, because there is various difficulties acquiring intel. This was generally because Okinawa had a sense of isolation from Japan. They didn't really include Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands in Japan. It was kind of like there was a sense of I don't want to say indigenous, but there's natives, a sense of isolation. So the U.S. military intelligence was primarily gained through um, POWs, prisoners of war, and various other historical documents. So we're going to see how this lack of intel is going to affect the U.S. later on in the battle. Now, on March 24th of 1945, codenamed L Day, which means landing day, we see the preparations of it start to come into play for the U.S. Now, mine sweeping as well as underwater demolition was put into place in order to clear the beach of any obstacles to enable the landing of several amphibious vehicles. And we see artillery being crucial for the invasion, as it could destroy defensive guns and keep the enemy from moving in and posing the landing. So initially the U.S. thinks that they're going to be pinned on the beach or the initial landing spot. Now, the Americans' first landings in the Ryukyus, which is again is the chain in which the island of Okinawa is in, is the Kurama Islands. This is approximately 15 miles west of Okinawa. The initial plan was to secure this island 6 days prior to the landing of Okinawa, to secure a seaplane base. You see, a place for the Americans' fleet to be anchored, and it meant for the U.S. fleet to recover from kamikaze attacks, which were prevalent in the ineffective use of suicide bombing by the Japanese against the U.S. So it served as a place to, gather. The U.S. could gather themselves, repair, and prepare. And also we saw the use of artillery support for the Okinawa landing initially. And this they secured this with little to no opposition. Now this is a map of Okinawa, and this is the Kurama Islands, so we can see it's relatively close to the island of Okinawa. Now the Japanese come to the realization that this could be the final straw. This could be the last line of defense we have until the U.S. ultimately attacks the mainland of Japan. So the army, the 32nd Army Division, consists of 120,000 men, are being deployed to Okinawa, and they take the days preparing by digging tunnel systems. They focus primarily on the southern eighth of the island, because because the terrain plays a huge role in this battle. So they fortify the southern eighth of the island. The terrain we see here is the reverse slopes. Let's see if I can. The reverse slopes. So when the enemy pushes, they're going to see little. They're going to probably see artillery fire along this slope. Then when they come down, this is when the Japanese go on the offensive. You see, then they fire. And they have the high ground. So the enemy then has to descend, then ascend again in order to take control. So this is going to be utilized to their advantage in the future comings of this battle. Now the tunnel systems act as a place for the Japanese to essentially hide out, essentially prepare, because they want the element of surprise on the Americans. They don't want the Americans to know. They want the Americans to essentially get caught off guard to how much preparation they took in order to defend it. They also slaughtered the livestock actually for food sources and other resources in order to provide for their army. They evacuated almost all of the population that was on Okinawa and the Okinawan Islands. Now we see on April 1st, 1945, we see the U.S. deliver some bombardments to the island in order to support the landing troops. So we see this bombardment take place, and there's no the Japanese aren't firing back. They're just laying low in the areas they have secured in the southern end of the island. They're laying low. The U.S. begins bombarding the island. They bombarded the central islands, and it's from the island of I'm sorry, I lost my footing. So they are bombarding the island in the central area because that's where they think that the ultimately where the forces are going to be. But it is all quiet after they finish bombarding. Okay. So during this time, the Japanese attempt a counter attack, if you will. So everything's silent on the island. They conduct a naval attack from an island called Kyushu, which is in the Bay area of Kagoshima. So they conduct this attack, which ultimately fails as Task Force 58. An aerial force deploys and stops the attack and puts a halt to their plans. Now the Japanese are left to strictly boots on the ground combat. Basically, they are going to basically wait till the U.S. lands on the island, and they're going to conduct their attacks from there. Now, after the minesweeping has been conducted several days prior, the bombardments have been conducted. Now we see troops hit the island. The U.S. troops hit the island of Okinawa. They land on the beach of Hagushi, which is on the eastern side of the island of Okinawa. There's little to no opposition. There's actually no opposition when they land. Okay, the U.S. is equipped with amphibious vehicles and tanks, such as the DD tank and the LVT, which is an amphibious vehicle, and they played a role in the securing of the beach, the front. Now the landing was a success. Again, there's little to no opposition. Okay. Now the Marine divisions. So this is the Bishi River. The Marine divisions kind of spread out amongst the Bishi River as they. Let me see if I can. Here. So this is the main landing point of the Americans on Okinawa. Now they start to push north. Actually, they push north, and the Bishi River is near in this region right here. So they push north and they occupy both ends of the Bishi River. Now there's only a couple smaller squadrons of soldiers, of Japanese soldiers, in the northern parts of Okinawa, such as this part and this part, this region, and they will not encounter these troops until further down the road. But remember, keep in mind that right here is where the Japanese are heavily fortified. It is the southern part of the island. Now, during the next 2 days, the U.S. they still have little to no opposition, but they have encountered these small troops that are north, and they take control of the Nakagusuku Bay, which is seen. The Nakagasuku Bay is seen on the other side of the island, pretty much parallel to where the landing point is. Now they secure this bay, and they start on April 2nd and 3rd, start to drive southbound. Okay, so the Americans have the river, the bay, and most of the northern part of the island secured. So they start driving southbound. So we see the 32nd Infantry. They start to drive down the edge of the Nakagusuku Bay. After about gaining about approximately 5,000 yards, they set up lines in front of Hill 165, which Hill 165 again is on the coast of Nagakasuku Bay, and from this hill we see the first Japanese line of defense. Okay, fire is received from the hill. Now, only a few Japanese were killed in a brief firefight. They exchanged fire, as well as 10 rounds of enemy artillery were received from the line of defense, the southern line of defense. At this point, basically the U.S. knows where to attack. They know now that the Japanese is resisting, and they have awakened the resistance. Now we are essentially going to see the U.S. idle after they take the hill line of Cuba. They're gonna idle while receiving aerial attacks from the Japanese. Now, who are the U.S. up against? Who are they combating in said altercation? So we're going to see the Japanese forces consist of about about 20,000 men were primarily used as labor from the capture of the well, I want to say capture, but they utilized some of the natives in order to help them and aid them with the use for labor, for tunnels, for surplus. But although they were outnumbered in the war, they still on the island had a great number of artillery and weaponry because they had fortified the areas. And the U.S. is like on the move. They're stationary. They know the land more, and they know how to conduct. You know where and when to conduct their attacks. Now, some of the forces are not properly trained because, like I've mentioned, this is seen as the final stand for the Japanese. All right, they need to put everything out there. They need to stop the Americans from coming onto their mainland. But altogether, the 32nd Army, led by Ushijima, that we met earlier, was consisted of 100,000 Japanese men. Now, now Shuri, which is one of the main battlegrounds we're going to see in this battle, provided the Japanese with a sound, strong defensive line. Now the Japanese had hopes of destroying or keeping the battle off the land, off the island until they destroyed the American fleet with kamikaze attacks, but this was not the case. They were not successful because with the U.S. securing the Kurama Islands, they had some power behind them because they had a place they had secure, they had artillery set up, effective artillery methods, and they were ready for the fight. They were ready for the attacks, and the Japanese kamikaze attacks fell short. Now, most of the Japanese forces already deemed it basically impossible to defeat the enemy, defeat the American people, but they aim to um, set off the attack on the mainland for as long as possible. So they put everything in it and such. And a fun fact: back on Japan, the propaganda was saying that the Japanese were in the lead in the wars. They were winning and they were close to being victorious. So this caused the Japanese people to enlist in a war they thought they were going to win. So that's why we see the 100,000 um, soldiers being at Okinawa, because realistically, no one's going to want to fight a war they're going to lose anyway and potentially risk um, potentially you know there might be heavy casualties. Now, the Shuri defense was where they wanted the American troops to go. That's where they wanted them to go because then they have the the terrain to work with and they have the upper hand, they have the high ground. So they wanted the Americans to essentially they waited and held off their main attack until they reached the Shuri defense line, the Shuri Hill, if you say. And these Shuri defenses consisted of caves, blockhouses, pillboxes. They fortified it as best as they could. They put everything they got. They skillfully camouflaged um, most of the tunnels in which the or the entrance to many of the tunnel systems to look like they were not there. They wanted the element of surprise. They wanted to utilize the reverse slope method, which I mentioned before, basically pin the American army at Shuri. Now this is where we're going to see most of the bloodshed begin. Okay. Now on April 8th, we see the U.S. begin their conquest of Kakazu Hill, which is the west side of the Japanese fortified defense. Now, although they were aided with planes and light artillery, they were seeing faults in their conquest. The Americans were. Now, prior to this, they wanted to have the element of surprise, so they attacked before dawn, before daylight, and they also called off artillery preparation in order to, not cause a scene before they were going to attack. Now, so the Americans try to flank on the east and the west side of the hill. They try to flank in order to, again, catch the Japanese off guard. And they ultimately it doesn't end well. They start their conquest on, again, the east and west points, and they underprepare. They're overwhelmed about the level of artillery the Japanese was providing, the level of gunfire, and this was significantly this took a toll on the Americans' push. Also, they did not have good positioning because, again, they had to climb uphill. As we know, having the high ground is always an advantage. Mind you that in the Kakazu Hills, the Japanese have created this was their most strongest positions in Okinawa. So when they realized that the flanks on the west and the east are not working, they then were instructed to focus primarily on the Kakazu West, the west side of the hill. Now, they were ordered to attack before dawn, and in the dark, the men had little to no comprehension of the land, and they lacked the detail necessary. So the enemy sees his opportunity as to take on the offensive because another U.S. squadron is trying to take Kakazu Ridge, which I believe in which Hacksaw Ridge takes place, the movie actually. But the enemy takes the offensive. They start to get aggressive against the Americans' positions because they know that they are not in a good position. So they start to take the aggression, and this is where we see U.S. casualties begin to climb. Now, continuing with this, companies. So, the United States military was broken up for this battle. Was broken up into companies. And they were referred to as companies and then a letter. So A, C, D, F, and so on. So companies A and C were pinned up against the hill as they tried conquering Kakazu West, the west side of the hill, and so they're pinned. And then it wasn't until companies A and C were supported by mortar fire and such from the American forces that they were able to pin the Japanese forces in the center of the hill. So they are going to pin the Japanese forces on the center of the hill, while Company L is going to gain the top of Kakazu West. If it wasn't for the heavy mortar fire and such, then this one wouldn't be possible because of the Japanese positioning. We start to see many of the Japanese feeling the pressure of the situation. They feel as if they know they are going to lose because Company L has taken the top of Kakazu West. They feel like there's no hope. So they start descending back into the trenches as heavy mortar fire is still continuing. And the U.S. then pushes forward and conquers Kakazu West and Kakazu Ridge. So now the Americans have control over Kakazu, the hill, and the ridge. Now they are looking forward to attack the press on into the main ring of Shuri defenses. So this is the main fortress, fortified position that the Japanese have been holding down and have been trying to stop the Americans from pushing forth. So on May 8th, we see the 6th Marine Division, along with the 7th and the 22nd Marines, attack on the west side of the defenses. So what the U.S. wanted to do was they wanted to pin, because they have the enemy where they wanted them. They had them pinned down, so they just all needed to concentrate on this one central defense line. So at this point, we start to see that the U.S. has the advantage and just has the Japanese outnumbered, and they need to take control of the Shuri defenses in order to push them back into surrender. Now the Japanese realize that they're cornered, so they try to go on the offensive in order to turn the tide, in order to, so they tried to penetrate Tanabaro, which goes south completely. So the battle's not in the Japanese favor. Okay. The Americans are pressing on. The Japanese, it seems like the Japanese cannot hold them. And in mid-May, the American forces soon occupy Shuri, the Shuri defense. And so Japan falls back to the Dak Yasadake barrier. This is the final straw. This is the last line of defense the Japanese can hold. This is the final point in the battle. And on May 31st, General Buckner orders the push on the south line of the barrier. Now at this point, the Japanese are running out of equipment, artillery, weaponry, and such. So they are trying. What's left of them is trying. Realize the U.S. is they are attacking with all they can, all they have on the barrier in order to secure the victory. And most of them they're just fleeing. They just want to escape. They don't want to fight. And this leads to most of the men committing suicide rather than surrendering. And this is, and only we see about 10,000 of the men survive. Although we see the U.S. come out victorious, this was one of the most blood that's been shed with an altercation between the U.S. and the Japanese. The U.S. suffered 80,000 casualties. That's a lot of people, and 110 Japanese men were killed. That's completely all what they had on the island. Okay, this battle came at a cost that was very high for the American people as well as the Japanese. Now we're going to see that the Americans have control of the island now, so they can then forward their stride to the Japanese mainland. They have the island, and they are going to push to the Japanese surrender, in which we see the use of the atomic bombs being dropped and the bombing of Tokyo. We also see that the Axis powers in Europe are out there under the ropes. We see that the Russians have taken the Allies' side, and the Germans are at the end of the ropes. And securing Okinawa meant that we could force the Japanese to surrender. Okay, so this is going to turn the tide of the war. The Allies are going to come on top and eventually become victorious, and they're going to force Germany to surrender. Thank you for watching. I hope you guys can take something away from this. Hope you learned something. Hope I taught you something. And I will see you guys in class. Thank you.